excited about this. Hello, friends. Welcome back to World Hoppers. For today's video, I am joined by my friends Kristen and Roger, whose channels I'll have linked. And we are going to be talking about fantasy romance. We're going to start by talking about our relationship with fantasy romance. Like, how much of it have we read? What do we think of fantasy romance as a genre or subgenre, depending on how we have come to it? And then that's probably going to inform which ones we really, really enjoy versus which ones we don't like as much. All of us are of the mindset that just because something doesn't work for us doesn't mean it's objectively bad. It's just not fitting our taste. So there might be certain things, and this is why I wanted to start by talking about what we consider to be fantasy romance and what we like about it or dislike about it. I want to start there because that way when you hear our best or worsts, it can kind of tell you maybe our best are actually ones you know you don't want to check out. Maybe our worst are the ones that you do, or maybe you line up with us. But just kind of kicking it off with, what is your experience with fantasy romance? Have you read a fair amount of it? Is it kind of new to you? Is it something that you read in the past, maybe with some Laurel K. Hamilton type of works? And is it the same as it was in the past? So Roger, what's your experience with fantasy romance?
I think that I've actually read quite a bit of it, although it's kind of sometimes hard to pin down exactly what I would consider fantasy romance. Because I know that it's been getting like further subcategorized into like romantic fantasy versus fantasy romance and like what is a romance. And then does fantasy romance have to be beholden to the same rules of romance, where romance is typically there has to be a happily ever after, but if it's a fantasy story that had a really strong romantic plot, but maybe it's not happening, does it still count? And so I think it just gets a little bit convoluted and complex. Because there was obviously things that I was reading, like Laurel K. Hamilton, way before I think fantasy romance was kind of in the picture. She was just considered urban fantasy for the longest time until she kind of did. I mean, there are like 3 or 4 books that turn into like 900-page smut. But at the time, I didn't know that that was a thing. And so I think, one, just trying to decide when it is fantasy romance versus not. Like, I think another more recent example is like The Spell Shop, where all of the marketing tells you that it's fantasy romance, but then when you read it, there's going to be some kind of disagreement. Is it cozy fantasy? Is it cozy fantasy with a romantic subplot? Is it cozy fantasy romance? Is it cozy romantic fantasy? Like,
Yes.
So I think I tend to lean more onto the side of I prefer things when it's a fantasy story and there is a strong romance plot in it. Or even if I'd say if it's like 60-40, I probably will really like it if it's fantasy to romance. If it's 60-70% romance to like 30-40% fantasy, I probably will like it less.
And I think I don't want to speak for you, but I think it's fair to say that, at least for you and me, and then Kristen, you can chime in here. But seeing as we've read some even around the same time, if it's, because you're talking about the subcategorizations here, if it's more of like 90% where it's not just romance cute, but it even leans into more like erotic fiction that's just in a fantasy setting, I feel like those are especially the ones where we're like, this might not be for me necessarily.
Or just sometimes I feel like things are just a lie when they're marketed. Like Captive Prince is not a romance. Why on earth is that marketed like it's a romance? Like, what? And then you read it and you're like, am I supposed to be rooting for something in this book?
Well, that definitely doesn't have the happily ever after. If that is,
at least not in book 1, maybe in books 2, 3, or how long is it? Is it a trilogy? I don't even remember.
Right, that's the tough part too. I mean, there's one that I'll mention that I definitely think it doesn't work if you just consider the first book. So then there's also the component of, well, if we look at it as a series versus a single book. So there's that as well. I will have a timestamp for anybody that's curious as to when we officially start talking about our personal bests and our personal worsts. But I wanted to make sure we had this portion of the conversation first, but I'll have that whenever we get to it. What would you say, Kristen, for yourself? What's your experience with it? And how do you come to it as far as what you consider to be fantasy romance versus not?
I feel similarly to Roger. I definitely prefer my fantasy romance to be more fantasy than romance. If you're sacrificing like world building and magic system for just romance, then I'm usually disappointed. And I find that, I was saying this to Elle earlier, but I feel like now that fantasy romance has gotten so big, there are a lot of authors that are writing in order to fit that genre. And for me, anytime that there is some kind of like buzzworthy genre that everybody is just talking about so much and people are actually like writing to fit that, that's when it tends to stop working for me. So a lot of the books that I like are ones that I enjoyed before fantasy romance existed. Like no one talked about that as a thing.
I had a whole conversation just yesterday with my husband, actually. We're walking around the park talking about the fact that I think every single genre, for the most part, I suppose I can't know this because I don't know the history of every single genre, but I definitely think there are elements, like what you're saying, that are somewhat related to or that we think of when we think of that genre. And when they're new, as in they're just emerging as their own thing, it's almost like we're taking what the possibilities were and then we're condensing it into something hyper specific. And then once it's kind of through that version of itself and it's fully emerged, it can start to branch out. And I had this conversation, especially relating to fantasy on its own, not even fantasy romance, but just fantasy, because we didn't have social media then. And I do think a lot of fantasy itself was also, you were seeing a lot of things that were Tolkien-esque to some degree, or had the chosen one. You had certain character types, certain plot lines or narrative structures that sort of played out in a similar fashion. But one, we didn't have marketing the way it is now. We didn't have TikTok and BookTube. And so I almost think you kind of stumbled into a work. You didn't even know what you were getting into originally. And that's another thing that's changed too, is you know so much ahead of time. And that, I think, also what you were saying, Kristen, it does, I don't know if it's the chicken or the egg sort of situation. Does it happen where the author wants to write for those things? Or is it that they write a book and then publishing is trying to get them to insert some of these things so that they can market it a certain way? And that's a whole conversation in of itself. But I do think that it's finding itself right now, and it will, I think, eventually get to a point where we see it open up into having a lot more possibilities. But I think that's why there's so many of us that don't quite know how to categorize it, don't know what fits into it and what doesn't. I agree, I think, with both of you as far as where my tastes lie. I actually think this is why cozy fantasy works so well for me, with a combination of having romantic elements as well, because what you were saying, Kristen, about you don't want the world building elements to suffer. I think that cozy fantasy doesn't always happen this way, but inherently the stakes and the world are smaller. And then if you just kind of have a love story in that, it almost relates to contemporary romance. It's just there's some kind of cute, quirky elements to it, things like that, where then you're like, oh, I really like this a lot because it's just whimsical enough and it's charming. And then there's something wholesome and cute. Not that all of our favorites are necessarily wholesome and cute, but I think that a lot of the romances I end up liking the most, as far as the literal characters falling in love with each other, are within fantasy books, because it's like to fall in love within all these epic things that are occurring. And there's that tension of like, they never have the time, but you can start to see the feelings developing, versus when everything is centered around, oh my gosh, look how hot that person is. It tends to not appeal as much to me necessarily, but everybody comes to it looking for something else. So we've already kind of touched on what tends to work for us and what doesn't. Can we be a little more specific about what you personally tend to like? So what makes a fantasy romance a best for you, generally speaking? And of course, I'm sure there will be some exceptions as well. So Roger, what tends to make it work for you?
I think on the romance front, I want to feel like there's some kind of genuine relationship there. Like them just being hot or having the biggest member or being the most mind-blowing lay ever is not enough for me. That doesn't feel romantic. And like, I don't mind if there is some smutty scenes and things like that, but I want there to feel like there was some kind of genuine connection. So I think on the romance front, it needs to feel like a genuine, real love and not just you're so hot. But then it also needs to not be like that crazy love where it's like, I don't care that the entire world is ending. We just need to have mind-blowing bang sesh one last time. Like, it's like, okay, come on. And then I like the world building to feel like there's some thought beyond it's just like a world to act as a backdrop to the romance. I want it to feel like it could stand on its own as a fantasy world, even if the story told wasn't necessarily a romance. And I think when you have that blend, then it kind of works for me.
And what about for you, Kristen?
Yeah, I feel exactly the same, I would say. There's honestly nothing to add.
Were there any tropes? Were there any tropes that either of you are like, that does get me? When I see that, I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I'll give that
Not
one
really,
a try.
because romance tropes
No.
are so weird. I'm like, okay, one bed, but that's like a scene. Is that a trope?
That's what I always think too.
Yeah, I do like enemies to lovers.
But do they need to be really enemies, or is it okay if they're inconvenient academic rivals, lovers, and it's called enemies?
It depends. Honestly, it depends on the characters and how much I like the characters.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing, is how, this is kind of what you were saying too, Roger, how believable is their dynamic? And also, I guess something that almost makes it worse for me is when we have banter that isn't really banter. It's just, what's the phrase, negging? Is that, or it's like they're, and it's not charming or cute. You know, when people are, I'm not going to explain it because I feel like that ends up sounding like it. But that whole thing of the characters never actually seem like they communicate. They never have a genuine conversation. There's no deeper understanding of each other. It's just attraction, which is, I don't mind when things start as attraction, but it's just attraction. And then suddenly I am head over heels in love with you. And like you said, I would burn the whole world to be with you. And you're like, why though? Why?
Yeah.
And also not even why from a moral standpoint of just like, but why do you, this person is so easily replaceable? And I want to feel like that's not true. So to your point, Kristen, when the characters stand out really exceptionally on their own, I think that makes me care so much more about the relationship. There is something too, for me, like I know there's a lot of tropes that don't fit within this, but I really like when you are just kind of waiting for these characters to finally meet, because there's like, you are starting to have the buildup where you're like, okay, I know that as soon as these two characters interact, that it's going to start getting even more interesting. And that can be present whether it's romantic or not, even if it's like these two characters are going to hate each other, these two characters are going to be best friends, whatever it is, when you build that anticipation of characters meeting. I don't know what you'd call that. I don't know if that's not really a trope. That's just something that occurs in basically every book. But
well, no, I think that would be slow burn.
Okay, then I like slow burn. I think that's probably an accurate way to put it. But slow burn, sometimes they know each other and then they don't even realize they like each other, or maybe they don't even like each other. They just interact. And then there will be some event where suddenly they start to look at each other a little different. It doesn't even enter their mind that it's romantic yet. So I you're right though. I do like slow burn. So thank you for understanding my taste better than me. So we've talked a little bit about what does and doesn't work for us. So let's just go ahead and jump now into the books, the specific books, and just for fun, let's start on a negative, and we'll go back and forth between the two, positives and negatives. So, Kristen, I'll let you. I know there's some overlap for some of us, and I don't know what you're gonna say first, but I'll let you go ahead and potentially steal one of the ones that we would say.
So I'll start with the one that is an overlap. All three of us did not like When the Moon Hatched. It was first of all, it was so long. It was such a long book. And it's just so uninteresting. Like I feel bad saying it, but I just like really did not like this book at all. I felt like the main character just drove me crazy. Like I did not like her. And it was really frustrating to spend that many pages inside of her head. I felt like there were some things, like some elements with past things that happened that could have been interesting, but they just weren't done well. Like the execution was not there. And then this one is, I guess you would say, hate to love, but it's also like, how did this happen? Like they do not like each other. And then all of a sudden there's like a very interesting scene on a couch. And you're just like, what?
It does come out of nowhere. And it's kind of just what Roger was saying of like, but they're so hot. They're also massive. The biggest man she's ever seen. I'm like, have you seen like okay, Roger is 6'8". I've met Roger. He's very tall. There are people even taller than that. So I'm like, this is not the tallest person you've ever met. Get out of here. That's not. That would be a really large person.
Yeah.
And in a world where there's different beings too, where I'm like, are there no humanoid beings bigger than this man? What? Sorry. I started to steal what you were saying. Keep going. Sorry.
No, I just, there was pretty much nothing redeeming about it to me. I just disliked it so much. It was the worst book that I read last year. It's quite possibly one of the worst books I've ever read.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I went into it with, I think, higher expectations because so many people seem to love it. And I was so disappointed.
Expectations can really affect, I think, the reading experience. I think for
I don't
me,
think it would have affected it if you went in with low expectations. I still don't think this book would have met them.
Well, yeah. It was funny because when I read it, because we kind of buddy read it, me and Roger. I think we mostly did. And when I started it, I was like, okay, especially the prologue. The prologue, I was thinking, this is really interesting. I like this sort of origin of the lore of the world and how everything came to be, this creation myth, I should say. And then when it first started, I was like, okay, I'm just getting acclimated. They're a little insufferable, but you know, I can go with it if they grow, which they don't. And I already could feel, I'm like, this is that snarky MC that we see over and over again. But maybe, you know, because sometimes authors will purposefully have those sorts of things so they can do something different with it. And then I do enjoy when that happens. Doesn't always have to transcend, but I do enjoy when they flip your expectations. So I kept thinking, okay, I don't know, I'm a little worried, but I'm willing to keep going. And the more it just like spiraled for me, where Roger, you can probably recount where the messages were like kind of normal at first, and I'm like, what is happening? What are these sentences and these lines with these characters? And some of the lines are so weird, and I'm with you. It did not work for me, but it also is just such a combination of so many different tropes that don't work for me, or that maybe individually are okay, but when you put them all together, it just feels like a mashup. Like, I by no means want to imply that I think that this author wrote anything as a means of sort of just stealing from other, because so many stories feel like they are inspired by others. So that's not what I'm saying at all, but it just felt like pieces of different plot lines that I'd seen before. And I think it didn't really end up feeling original in hardly any way, even though there were interesting aspects to the world building. So it should have felt, I think, more creative.
Well, plus the world building was always last minute. It would just all of a sudden be like, oh, here's some random new creature that you've never heard before, but is really actually very important. And you're like, okay, like, and once is fine.
And that the main character always knew about.
Yeah.
She would give you basically an explanation as to this creature in this weird trial with these people that want to marry me, it's actually one of these things. And you're like, how do you know this? Because then nothing feels like a surprise. Let her be shocked about something. Because then I'll be like, what is this creature? She doesn't know either. That can create a level of suspense. I can see why people like it, though, because it does have so many of those pieces that I think are ingredients to the recipe that works in a lot of fantasy romance books. But it didn't really work for us. But Roger, you also, because it was one that didn't work for you, do you want to add to this?
I mean, she was not even just a snarky main character. She was like moronically abrasive to the point where even when she's like being physically tortured, she's still like, oh yeah. And I'm like, oh. Like, what are you doing? And then like with the guy that she ends up having the hots with, she's like, I'm gonna kill you. Blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden the couch scene happens and you're like, what? And then they reveal later, like, there's some circumstances around why maybe he has deeper feelings for her than we originally realized. But it's just like, but why?
Yeah.
I don't even care if I, like, no.
But she doesn't have, well, okay, I think we all understand what the other is saying when we say, we get why he feels the way he feels, which is conflicted. But for her, you're like,
but you hate him. And you think he's like,
yeah, you think you hate him. So what? I think that's our reaction all of us are very just question marks. What's that meme of the guy that looks and there's like the question marks coming out of his head? The GIF.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I feel a lot of us felt about that. And like you said, Kristen, it is very long. I think that's why the spiraling started to happen as well. I feel kind of bad though, because I know the author worked hard on it, I'm sure, and there are pieces of it that work for other people. These just were all components that didn't really work for us. Do you want to
for
have
people to be like, it's Fourth Wing but better? Fourth Wing was better than it.
I liked
Fourth Wing didn't
Wing
make you
much
spiral
better.
as much. Fourth Wing didn't make you spiral as much and make me spiral as much.
Well, hold on though. Part of it is that Fourth Wing, I spiraled like immediately though. Do you remember as soon as I started it? Because I didn't realize I accidentally bought it before it was officially out. And I was like, I'll go ahead and start it. I got it. And then I was like, okay, hold on. And I started messaging you immediately being like, okay, I have to say, you know, I know people don't care about the period thing when there's periods between words. I don't mind that sparingly. It's a lot in Fourth Wing. And the way it's used is you might as well have the clapping emoji between all the words. You know, when people say something online and they're like, whatever the case, whatever they're saying, where they're like, no, it's not. That's how I read it. And I was like, I don't like this. This feels like how people text. It's not.
But if you had to reread one of them, would you reread When the Moon Hatched or would you reread Fourth Wing? If you had to pick.
Fourth Wing is easier to read, I suppose. But I mean, that's like asking if I'd rather rewatch a sitcom or like a documentary. And sometimes you're like, well, a 20-minute long episode versus like this docu-series that's 8 hours long. If I have a lot to do, I might pick the sitcom I don't like that much, you know? Anyway, but I don't know if that I think I liked the writing more in When the Moon Hatched than the writing in Fourth Wing is perhaps a better way to put it. I think Fourth Wing is more compulsively readable, though. I certainly will give Fourth Wing that. It's not like it was challenging to my brain to get through that, you know?
I actually liked Fourth Wing.
I know.
I wasn't like, oh my God, I'm obsessed with this. This is the best book I've read in ages. But I also didn't hate it. I thought it just felt kind of like nostalgic. It felt like reading like a YA series from when I was a teen, except that there's like more romantic scenes. So I thought that it was fun. I guess I like didn't go into it taking it very seriously, and I didn't have high expectations, and I ended up thinking it was fun.
So those expectations again,
Yeah.
you know, because for me, I went in and I'm like, all the early reviews are super positive. So this must be mind blowing and unique and original and so different. And I was like, this is not those things for me. But that's okay. I'm glad it works for. I always want to say I'm glad it works for so many people, and that it's brought so many people so much excitement and love, and they can be a part of this fandom, because that is a sensation too when those releases happen, and that's exciting. And a lot of people are getting into reading or getting into fantasy romance or fantasy because of that book, and that's awesome. We do need books like that are inviting and that are page turners and are action packed and exciting and people feel seen by. So just because I can't stand the character or the writing style, gosh. And also the whole like my woman, my house, my throne or whatever, I'm just like, well, you might as well be a dog and urinate all over something. That's what that feels like to me. It's like mine. I'm like, that's not normal human behavior. I don't like it in books either. So anyway, Roger, I know we were going to go into a positive, but I feel maybe we should just kind of continue. So Roger, do you want to list one that didn't work for you?
Sure. House of Sky and Breath, which is book 2 in the Crescent City series. I really liked book 1 because I do love that kind of urban fantasy feel, even though it's like a secondary world. And it was really interesting seeing her deal with the trauma of the event that happens in the first chunk of the book and finding out some of the mysteries. And then book 2, we took such a hard left into the like horny lane where literally their conversations would be like, oh, I wish you were balls deep. Or like they couldn't even exist in public without just being like really like acting like they were 13 and like had first gotten into physical relations for the first time in their entire existence. And he's supposed to be like super old, like some ancient angelic being. And I'm just like, but he talks like he's 9, thinking of what high schoolers talk like. And it's just, And then I hate a plotline that feels like it was all for nothing, because then all of a sudden there's like this really quick resolution that was just kind of tucked away, because that whole book was more about them just going to Pound Town. And it was so irritating because book one was so much fun. So I think that one was even like exacerbated because I was like excited because it's book two. Yeah. And I was like, oh, okay, never mind.
Did you read book 3? I can't remember.
Yeah, I did.
How did that compare?
It was much better because they were actually physically separated for like 600 pages of it and couldn't interact anymore.
That's so funny because I felt like I struggled with book 3 more. And it was because by that time there were so many relationships that it was constantly like, now there's a sex scene between these characters. Now there's a sex scene between these characters. Now there's one between these characters. So it was
I feel like it got to that in the later parts of the book, but in the beginning when she's just like spelunking and finding out lore, like that Tomb Raider vibe was so my thing.
That's fair.
I'll go now. So Roger, you've also read this, and you can chime in. Can you guess what I'm gonna say?
I don't know, because I feel like so much of the popular fantasy romance you picked up you didn't like.
I know. Game of Fate.
Oh.
A classic for me. Yes, a classic. So this is absolutely an instance of, I thought perhaps it was going to be slightly more fantasy and plot than it was. This one is much more kind of smutty, bare bones with the lore. And this came out around when there was a huge sudden surge of Persephone and Hades retellings. And this one just wasn't for me for a number of reasons. But what you were just describing about this character in House of Sky and Breath, who's supposed to be somebody who has lived a long life and thus they have many experiences. I felt like the character in this book is supposed to be like that, but then the second they see Persephone, they're already ready to go and they can't think and concentrate and all these things, which I'm always like, is that sexy? I don't think so. Like to me that just, it's kind of icky when they're like that. It's one thing if during a scene where the characters are allowed a moment of intimacy, if it's like, of course, you want them to not be like daydreaming about what they're going to eat for breakfast tomorrow. That would be not the most exciting of interactions. But when they can't focus on literally anything, to me, I'm like, you do not feel mature. And I don't know, perhaps I'm a sucker for maturity, but I'm like, can we focus right now, please? And they could never focus. And plus, with the whole Hades Persephone plot lines, Persephone always has to be like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. But I also am like secretly also for some reason out of nowhere very experienced and I can do all the things very well and I know how to be very seductive and you're like how?
And also she tries a cherry stem with her tongue out of nowhere.
But yeah, that one truly was just it was I think written toward the spice, which is not my cup of tea. It was really funny when I read it because there were some that were like, well, you didn't read her, because the way it's set up is there's her series, the Persephone series, and then these are Hades' perspective. And some people were saying, well, you're just lost because you didn't read Persephone's. And I'm like, no.
I actually read the first one of Persephone's.
I hear it's more plot than
yeah.
I
read it pretty quickly. It was fine. It wasn't great. Obviously I didn't continue. But it wasn't from her perspective as bad, I think, as you're saying. So maybe like being in his head was
I think that's definitely I think that is similar to what some people were saying as well. And to me that also makes me, and Roger, you can chime in here. This makes me a little uncomfortable whenever the male perspective is written in such a negative stereotype of what men are like, of this just constant, that's all I can think about. But also I respect you and I'm a feminist, but also like I just want to, and you're just like, okay, obviously it's a little different for you, but I mean like as a man, you know what I'm saying? It's not like constant running loop of I have to do it now, right now, right now. It's just so hard to concentrate on literally anything else. Is it so difficult to concentrate right now on having a conversation with us blobby ladies over here? You're just like, oh, it's hard to even look at them. I wish I had some man meat to look at. That's not what's going on in your head constantly. You know, the problem is that it's like you just don't know what it's like for straight men, Roger. So you can't. Yeah. It's a very specific kind. None of us can know. Where's Sean? We should bring Sean in. He can chime in. Okay, let's talk about some that we love. And since Kristen, you went first before, so Roger, you can go first this time. We'll actually go in reverse order. So Kristen, you'll go second.
Okay, one that I just read this month that just came out this month was Immortal by Sue Lin Tan. It's like a standalone, but it's in the Daughter of the Moon Goddess, world. But it's completely separate. Like, you don't have to have read that duology, and I don't think that anything in this standalone spoiled any. Like, they're very separate, but in the same world. And I was surprised because usually the kind of dramatic soap opera-y feeling like is not necessarily my jam. But there was something about just, I mean, I think even when you read Daughter of the Moon Goddess L, like you remember just like her world was so pretty and like lush, and like we still had those elements of it, and just the deepening mystery. There was this really cool thing happening, and it's another one of those ones where basically the immortals have kind of annexed this area because they trapped their ancient enemies there, and they seem to be escaping and harming the humans. And so this girl who's the daughter of kind of the leader of the people there goes to the immortal cities to try to get them to help her. And things ensue from there. But I think it's one of those ones where like the plot was really interesting. There was a lot of mysteries and twists and turns. Their dynamics started off quite antagonistic between her and who you can obviously tell is a love interest like very early on. But then it starts to get deeper and you're like, oh, wait, is something else going on? And then it was so much fun. It's really fun and really short and a standalone, which also helps.
I am excited for that one.
Me too.
I pre-ordered it, so
Ooh.
I have it now. Whenever.
Because I feel like it just came out like 2 or 3 days ago, right? Like on the 28th of January, something like that.
It came out really recent, yeah.
Yeah.
Such a pretty cover.
She is blessed by the cover gods.
Yeah.
Yes. That's what I was gonna say. Lucky. They're so beautiful. Kristen, what's one for you?
So one of my favorites that's more recent is the Shepherd King duology by Rachel Gillig. I know, Roger, you were just telling me about the Arc of Night and the Moth.
Well, it's not even the arc. They literally sent just a postcard that's like the arc is coming.
Oh,
it's like a very.
Oh, I figured that was like in a box with the book.
No,
that's funny. But so this duology, I think the world building is really, really strong. It takes place in a kingdom that is like shrouded in mist. There's been this blight on the land for a long time. And there's this like magical deck of tarot cards that the main character and the knight of this world are like uniting in order to get the deck together and try to like save this world. I liked the first book. I thought was like really fun. And then the second book I loved. And I think it's because we got some more perspectives in the second book and we got like a second relationship. And I really liked that relationship a lot. But I just thought it was really fun, really well written. It's incredibly atmospheric and just really, really enjoyable. And also nice that it's a duology and both books are not that long. So it's like a very easy, just comforting read.
I feel like that's one that I've always heard people kind of argue that like maybe it's not even fantasy romance, that like it's more fantasy. And I'm like, perfect. Yeah. As soon as people start having that argument, I'm like, I might actually like it.
Exactly. Yeah. That's how I felt. I felt like it was more fantasy.
I DNF'd that one.
Really?
Yeah, but I don't disagree with how you've described it as being very atmospheric. And the world building was really interesting. I think I just wasn't invested in the characters, but I'm discovering, because I feel this way about Adrienne Young's works, when things are extremely atmospheric, I almost think sometimes you lose me because I get so caught up in the atmosphere that I almost feel like it becomes more difficult to connect to other aspects, which is stupid. But it's just some like weird quirk for me, and that one fell into it. But I didn't hate it by any means. I didn't DNF it because I thought, oh, this book is awful, or I can't do it, it's so annoying, or anything like that. I would consider maybe giving that one another try, especially because I had seen some people dislike that the second one somewhat follows different characters. But I think, especially if you know ahead of time that that's going to happen, it doesn't necessarily bug me at all. It can be kind of fun.
Mm-hmm.
And our friend recently has been reading that one and really quite liked it. It's definitely like what Roger's saying. I see people feel very mixed on it. Okay, I'm gonna say one that I really like, and then we'll do another round of really like some of our favorites. One that I have talked about quite often would be the Very Secret Society of Regular Witches, and I wanted to bring this one up first because of what I talked about before. We're feeling like sometimes ones that feel exceptionally cozy, I think, end up working more for me because it doesn't have to fight against the fantasy elements for attention. It can just kind of slip into that. And this one's interesting in that I think some people would certainly not disagree that it's romantic, but they might disagree with there's not enough fantasy to categorize it as fantasy romance, rather than there's not enough romance to categorize it as fantasy romance. And I feel similarly about the Spell Shop, which Roger, I'm sure you'll probably want to bring that one up because you really like that one, where they're both just so cute and they're so like kind of just cozy. I mean, that's the best way I think to describe both of those. And they still do a really good job of making you feel like you get to know that found family, all those other characters that fit within that. And so the love interests often fit within the found family. So it feels more like you're building these connections that have more meaning than just attraction. But I'm also going to mention, because I really like it, which would be Mages of the Wheel. I'll put up on the screen. Hi, Sean. I'll put up on the screen the first one. I did read the second in this series, and I actually think the second one might fit the tastes of people who prefer more romance than fantasy. But for me, I really liked the fact that the first one was so fantasy, like very politically driven. And I really liked the aspects to the main character in the court and also her familial situation. I don't want to say too much about that. I thought that was handled really well. I really liked the love interest as a character already. And then that one also had what I was talking about, where I was like, okay, I can't wait for these two characters to meet, because especially her, she's kind of a quiet force to be reckoned with. And he doesn't know what he's entering into. So he also is, they're by no means enemies, but he's just kind of like got to figure out the court that he's walking into and how she plays a role in it and how her adversaries play a role, and he doesn't know who to trust. And that just created a lot more intrigue beyond just the characters. So I really, really enjoyed that one a lot. But those are so drastically different from each other. And I think one feels a lot more wholesome. One feels a lot more fantasy and intrigue heavy. Kristen, what's another favorite for you?
Another favorite for me would be Divine Rivals, or the Letters of Enchantment duology. That one is one where I'm like, is this fantasy romance?
Right.
I'm not really sure, but it is fantasy with romance, and I just really enjoyed it. It's very whimsical, and I like how well developed the world is once again. You really feel like you are like there and you understand why this war is happening. And I really like how it's not like a super overt magic system. There's just like little touches of magic here and there. Like I remember like there was one where they were talking about how like there was a pair of old shoes and then like a flower started growing out of them. It's just like fun little like flourishes.
It's Studio Ghibli almost.
Very much, yeah. And I really liked the like rivalry. There was kind of like a you've got mail situation going on with these enchanted typewriters.
That's the journalist one, right? Where they're like journalists of some flavor.
Yeah, they're both journalists. They're competing for this one position at their newspaper, and Iris sees them as rivals, and Roman does not feel that way. And it's really cute. Like you can tell he is the one that falls first, and just watching their progression and the unexpected turns that it takes.
It's very tragic.
Very tragic, but really
no wonder
enjoyable.
Elle likes it.
I know. I know.
Yeah, I like tragedy in my romance.
Such a perfect opportunity to be comforted.
Yeah.
Just kidding. Yeah, it is, you know, the writing's not going to, of course, work for everybody, but I quite liked the writing in that one because it has this, I mean, I wouldn't say it's quite like Laini Taylor because it's not quite that colorful, but it's almost like it has this whimsy combined with some strikingly beautiful moments that maybe for some will feel a little pretentious or a little fluffy or purple. But the combination, I just thought, resulted in something at times that sort of had this allure to it, and then other times was so cutting, and it really pulled a lot out of you. It makes you feel like what the characters are feeling as well. Because there are some parts that stand out to me quite a bit. My husband's a sucker for pretty writing. So there were times that I would be like, what do you think of this passage? And he's like, wow, I liked that a lot. Plus, like both of you have pointed out, with it being the journalists, I just feel like they're never the heroes. And what Iris is willing to give up to tell the truth as well, I think makes her an exceptionally brave character. I'm slightly distracted because Luna is rolling around on one of her toys. So she's just like grumbling and like rolling all over it. And then now it's in her mouth and she's tossing it around. So apologies. If you end up hearing weird noises, that's what's happening. Did you have more to add about Divine Rivals? I love it too. So I kind of started taking over, I feel.
No, the only other thing I would say is for me personally, I thought that the first book was stronger than the second book.
Me too. Roger, another one you like.
I would say the Cerulean Chronicles, and I know that Elle is a naysayer, but House on the Cerulean Sea and Somewhere Beyond the Sea. It's just, I think even book 2 even more so because their relationship is established and you get to see them kind of lean on each other in difficult circumstances. I think it kind of helps add to their relationship, but it is one of those ones where it's a lot more about the family coming together and this guy who feels like he's been living this drab life and has always been dreaming of something else finds this very vivacious character, and they don't seem like they would go together, but somehow they do. And then they have all these adorable little precocious children that are in this like magical orphanage, basically. And it's just so cute and wholesome, and everything. It's very cute.
I agree.
It's
I feel like
cute.
people always say like Legends and Lattes was what started cozy fantasy, but I feel like the House on the Cerulean Sea is.
Yeah, I've had to correct myself before because I have said that. And then I think, and I'm like, no, House on the Cerulean Sea. But I think they started like different versions of cozy fantasy because I think maybe in a basic way of putting it, I think Legends and Lattes kind of brought cozy fantasy to the more epic fantasy readers where they're like, you're welcome here too. There's cozy fantasy for you as well. And it's more sword and sorcery, whereas the other one, it almost invites, I think, like a contemporary audience and just a general fiction audience into fantasy. Not that fantasy readers, of course, wouldn't enjoy that because obviously plenty do. But I think they sort of represent cozy to different audiences, which is why I think it's so exciting that both of them have been so successful. Do you, just out of curiosity, are either of you worried that, because I feel like I've already seen some of this happen, but are either of you worried that cozy fantasy is going to start getting the fantasy romance treatment where it's just getting pumped out, cranked out? Feels like what you described early on, Kristen, about maybe some authors are writing for it, because I feel like it's starting to happen and I hope it doesn't get to be too intense.
I feel that way too. And in addition to authors like writing to the genre, I also feel like whenever there's a buzzword, publishers will just get as much of it out as they can so that they can sell to that genre. And then there's a lot of quality that goes down because they just want to have the titles like available. And yeah, so I feel like that's always when I drop off of liking something.
Yeah. Roger, because I briefly brought up the spell shop, but this kind of fits in to go against what I was just saying, which I feel like this is part of why the spell shop was so nice for a lot of us, is that I feel, first off, Sarah Beth Durst is an established fantasy writer already and has written very differently from one book to the next, which you'll find out soon, right? Because you haven't read Race of Sands. You read the other one,
I've read the Bone Maker, and I've read the
Queens of Renthia.
That one. So I've read several books by her, but not Race of the Sands yet.
Yeah, Race of Sands quite different for sure from Queens of Renthia, but the spell shop is so different from those. And it's kind of like, look, continuing the Travis Baldree feeling of us that are like very picky about the fantasy stuff, maybe overly so at times, we almost feel like, oh, we're spoiled because we get it in this book too, where it has all the charm, it has all the whimsy, but in a world that feels like beyond this story is something great, meaning like greater than even this like little moment here. And on top of that, I almost feel like she could write a very dark story within that same setting and it would still work, even if it doesn't seem like that should make any sense. But I wanted you to, because I know you really liked the Spell Shop as well.
The Spell Shop is just one of those ones. I feel like I do agree that it's hard to maybe call it romantasy, because even the romantic relationship that is there isn't really like an A plot. It's kind of like a B plot, and it like is there. Unlike where I think House in the Cerulean Sea, like Arthur and Linus coming together is one of like the main focal points. The Spell Shop isn't as much like that, but it is. It also has surprisingly deep things, like deep themes, like you're talking about, where it's like the hoarding of power by the rich and like the kind of after effects that can have on places that are off to the side. And there is a lot more interesting there than I think people sometimes would say cozy fantasy should or could have. Because I know like the whole thing with Legends of Zates is it's like, what is it? High fantasy, low stakes or something like that. And like, I don't think that the stakes are necessarily all that low in Sarah Beth Durst, just maybe because I've read her other books and sometimes she can get real dark. But it's so good. The Spell Shop is really good.
Kristen, have you read that one?
I have. I really enjoyed it too, but I definitely thought of it more as cozy fantasy than romantasy.
Right.
But it was literally billed as her romantasy debut, which was interesting.
Yeah,
that could give people misleading expectations.
And it was in the Goodreads nominees under fantasy romance, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought, like, because I have seen her other work, and I thought for sure, like, some of her other things would be more likely to be considered fantasy romance than Spell Shop.
Because even Bone Maker, I would say, is probably more about the relationship between this lady and her husband than like Spell Shop is.
That is interesting. I wonder if they felt like it would be more successful. And interestingly, I think it has been her most successful, at least upon first being published. So I don't by any means mind if people want to consider it. I'm not defensive, like there's no way, because sometimes people will say for adult fantasy they'll be like, it actually felt kind of young adult to me, and people are like, how dare you, and you're like, that's not an insult. It's just sometimes things do feel slightly more like they fit somewhere else. I think the only reason that the categorization accuracy matters to me is for something that we've brought up multiple times: people's expectations. And the reverse can happen as well. Sometimes people expect to go into something thinking this is a fantasy and it's a fantasy romance. And that's kind of sad because you're robbing the audience and the author of the good positive results. You want books to find their audience, and it's good.
Which one? I feel like there was one that was recent that was like really,
Five Broken Blades. Yeah, I still haven't read it. I want to, but everybody I saw was like, this is a fantasy romance. What's happening? And then wasn't it nominated in fantasy and not fantasy romance? Yeah, so it seemed like this one in the Spell Shop could have maybe swapped.
Is that the My Cortland book?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like it's pretty safe to assume that anything published by Red Tower is romantasy.
Isn't that
is it by Red Tower?
What?
Is that Fourth Wings? Is that Fourth Wings publisher?
I think so.
I thought Fourth Wing was one of the first ones that they really got behind too, kind of establishing themselves.
Yeah.
Isn't it from Tor technically?
That's Bramble.
Okay. I wasn't totally sure.
I could be wrong, but I feel like Red Tower could be like an Entangled kind of offshoot.
Doesn't really matter. I was going to see if I could figure out Entangled Publishing. And then I'd be curious to know what Entangled Publishing is part of, because they're all part of something else. If you go
Entangled I feel like Entangled used to be Harper, and then it got sold to something, or it used to be something else, and then it got sold to Harper. I can't remember off the top of my head, but
Macmillan, is it Macmillan? That's what I'm seeing. Macmillan Entangled Publishing. So
okay, yeah,
maybe that's what I was thinking of. And now that I'm thinking about it, maybe the reason I thought there's a Tor connection is because
Tor's Macmillan.
Yeah, right? Because I'm thinking of like Michael Kramer saying Macmillan Audio presents. And then I always associate him with Tor. This is a side tangent. Really quick, just because so much I feel like of the conversation thus far has been us being like, I like this one. I don't know if it's fantasy romance, but I do like it. What of your favorites, or at least ones that you actually like, do you feel properly fit within fantasy romance? I'll go first because I know I kind of threw that question out without maybe everybody being ready for it, but I do like the Bridge Kingdom. I like the Bridge Kingdom because I think it might have helped that in A Fate Inked in Blood is a little different because it does have magic. But with the Bridge Kingdom, I actually feel like because she could just focus on the political aspects, and the political aspects directly relate to the romantic aspects, I thought it blended really well. And it has the tension that makes sense. Oh, kitty. The tension, I think, makes sense. It doesn't feel too forced. There is a little hint of they keep thinking that the other character is very attractive, to a point where you're like, we know they're both very attractive people. But I had fun with it. And I think the second set of duologies, or the second duology, I should say, the second book in that, had some really fun backstabbing moments and twists and turns, and I do think there's the occasional moment that feels a little like we had to throw a wrench in things to pull the characters apart. I mean, there's some aspects to it that feel a little formulaic or a little forced at times, but I still feel, especially when I think about when it was released and how it's been around for a while, a point that Kristen, you've made multiple times about feeling like people are writing for the tropes or writing for this genre. It really genuinely feels like this was just a story that the author wanted to tell. And yeah, it contains some tropes, of course, like any book does, but it didn't feel like we were trying to fulfill a checklist, or like we had, because it was self-published initially. You didn't have any kind of input from someone else telling you what to put into it. So it really kind of got to be its own thing. At least that's how it reads to me. And so it's kind of fun to see it continuing to do well, because it's such a mix of, it got to be its own thing, and what its own thing was has turned out to appeal to a lot of readers. So many different covers at this point. So as long as you find that author, Danielle Jensen, at the bottom of one of them, you've found the correct work. I am kind of sad for people who like the series who are just finding it, because the original covers, which I don't know if anybody's got, kind of, sort of, but these covers, which I do think the art's kind of cool on these, I own them, so I've seen it, but if you take the sleeve off, it has something like this, and when you put all the books together, that's what the naked hardback has. When you put them all together, it shows the entire map, kind of, or the area, it like all goes, so it's like you fit them all together, and I think that's pretty fun. And people don't get that. Plus, they're not hardbacks anymore. I think they're just paperbacks in the new releases. But I think the author has said there might be a box set release at some point. Not that that's relevant to the story, but that would be one of mine anyway. I actually do think Mages of the Wheel fits well. I just think it is more potentially appealing to the fantasy fan for the elements that I discussed. But the Bridge Kingdom, I think, fits comfortably in fantasy romance. And it's one that I did quite enjoy. So, Kristen, is there one that you feel really fits comfortably and represents that genre that you love?
Yes. For me, it would be before fantasy romance existed, but ACOTAR. I feel like that kind of defined the genre. It definitely starts out more tame, and then book 2 is where things really amp up. And I think like at the time when that came out, because this is a series that does have really strong world building. So for A Court of Mist and Fury, when that did release, it was also kind of shocking to see like the amount of scenes that were in it that were on the smutty side. And I think people were like found it like exciting because this just like hadn't existed before. And then it definitely gets like, we get to A Court of Silver Flames, and then it's like a lot. And I prefer the core trilogy to anything that came afterward, like the novella and A Court of Silver Flames. But I think this was really like a genre defining series.
Trendsetter for sure.
Yeah.
She did do some unique things that I still don't want to spoil in case somebody hasn't read it and plans to come to it, but a decision she made between books 1 and 2 was something a lot of people hadn't seen before. And I want to add to what you mentioned about the fact that it was exciting because people are like, I've not really seen the romantic aspects of the fantasy story go to these places, some of which were emotional development, reflecting on trauma, but then also, of course, the physicality of the interactions. I'll say I don't think it was as present in traditionally published works.
No.
I think it was more there in like urban fantasy, like what Roger was talking about, or in self-pub works, erotic fiction that in the past everybody would just kind of put things under that umbrella when really there was differences even in that category, but you didn't see that shelved typically just normally. Not to say it's like extremely erotic necessarily, but I think that we just hadn't seen that be more mainstream before. I think that contributes to the explosion of fantasy romance as a whole at this point, is because it's almost like more accepted now. That it's like, yeah, a lot of people online have quietly liked this and found little forums or groups where they can discuss. And now that a lot of people are like, yeah, no, I enjoy this, then it's like, oh, a celebration almost is what it feels like is happening.
What's interesting too is that ACOTAR was released as YA,
Right.
and it wasn't until like 2020 that they decided to rebrand, release it as adult, and start charging adult prices like for the hardcovers.
The charging thing is not my favorite, but
yeah. So it really, I feel like, yeah, like in adult urban fantasy, it was very common to see that kind of thing. But I do feel like urban fantasy typically was a little bit lighter on world building. So it depending.
Except for Laurel K. Hamilton.
Well, I haven't read that. I can't speak to that. I can't say. The urban fantasy that I have read is usually closer to our own world than ACOTAR is.
I also, so we don't have to go on a whole thing about YA versus adult, but I do think that moving it to adult makes sense because some of the experiences of the character, and I'm not necessarily even talking about just the explicit nature of certain scenes, but some of the experiences feel more accurate to somebody who's slightly older than your average teen. Not that teens don't experience some of the things that our character in that experiences, but I think that, didn't it also, there was that time that it seemed like new adult might actually be its own thing, and then ACOTAR kind of seemed more like that, but because it wasn't, then they're like, new, okay, we'll just put this in young adult then. And
Yeah.
that was right around when I feel like there was a lot of pushback on the fact that a lot of YA was like, these are written by and for girls and women, and
Yes.
this fantasy is for men and boys, and people are like, this is a weird way to separate them, because there were authors who existed before young adult existed as its own age range, and then those authors just got put in YA if they were women, when you're like, this is similar to Wheel of Time in how it's written and the characters in the world. Why are you putting it in YA? So I think that ACOTAR seemed like it was right around that time, and maybe that's why it got shelved, is because it doesn't really feel, I feel like the series didn't really feel young adult to me at any point, so it was always kind of an odd place.
I think it was just because Throne of Glass, the first Throne of Glass book, is definitely a YA book, and Bloomsbury published that. So to continue on, like, to, I guess, have her same readers, it made sense to release it to that genre.
I realized as I was saying it, I was like, oh wait, yeah, Throne of Glass. But it was, I remember always seeing like Bloomsbury, like best children's fiction, and then seeing ACOTAR, and you're like, that's a little weird to see it in that way. Roger, what's one for you that comfortably fits within?
I think Immortal definitely would fit into fantasy romance, no question. And then I think Bitter Medicine, that recently came out, I think towards the end of last year, by Mia Sai or something like that. I think it would definitely appeal to people who are usually more into contemporary romance because it definitely feels kind of like that, but it's definitely in a fantasy world. And there's like a spicy scene, but we take some time to get there. There's actual interactions and the will they, won't they. And then when you get to that time, it feels kind of like earned per se. And I think that also it does have like similar beats that you would expect from romance. Like there is kind of like a third act breakup adjacent thing that happens, but it's kind of from both of them processing some things that happened in the events of the plot that happens between them. So I think it's also, so I think that one definitely, I think it hits beats that contemporary romance readers would like, but it is like definitely a fantasy book.
I want us to go now back to ranting. I miss it, Roger. I need a good Roger angry session for a moment. What's another one that?
So I have two, but I'll stick with the one that's more fantasy because the other one's sci-fi. But the fantasy one would be The Captive Prince, which is obviously one just mismarketed because it's not romance in any flavor. But if I pretend like it is and I read it like I'm thinking that it is romantic, I feel like it romanticizes some really toxic, messed up things where it's romanticizing basically sex slavery. And like, I think I'm supposed to maybe be aroused by situations in that story because like I'm told where people finish and how they weren't into it and then they get into it. And I'm just like, it's so gross. Like, why? It's not gross that we have that kind of description. I don't care. But like, if it just feels like it's romanticizing really toxic stereotypes about one, gay men, and two, just sex slavery is not sexy. And like, fine, if you want to call it dark romance, and I get that some people enjoy the tabooness of it all and whatever, but that's not what it's marketed as. And like those covers that Elle was showing where they're all like cutesy and cartoony and it matches the art style of her YA series where I'm just like, this, if your YA readers are just like, oh, I liked a book. That's what happened to me. Because Elle was like, oh, do you want to read The Captive Prince? And I was like, sure. I read Dark Rise and I thought it was cute. Like, I didn't even look into the book and I read it and I was like, what on earth am I reading?
Well, I felt so bad too because I already knew, I didn't know much about it, but I knew from some of the fan art that it was going to be dark. But I didn't realize that you didn't have that knowledge. I thought you
I only knew about Dark Rise, and I was just like,
sorry.
oh, sure, maybe it's like a more adult, like more romantic than that one was.
I still was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry because
that series also just kind of grinds my gears because I don't mean to typecast or stereotype people, but that author is a white female presenting individual, and every book that she's written is focused on male romances, and they always have this taboo flavor, which starts to get into this kind of weird fetishizing thing for me that I think also just like irritates me when I'm like, okay, but like, why though? Why is it always like this weird power dynamic? Because even in the YA series, there is this question of like consent because there's this magical compulsory collar between the two male love interests. And then in this series, it's like the prince owns him and forces him to do things. And it's, I hate it. I hate it all. And it's not romantic in any way. Did you ever continue on with the series? I feel like you said that you were going to try to see.
I do plan to keep going because the whole reason I picked it up is because people were like, it's fantasy romance. And I'm like, in this first one, it's not. It's like, I think dark romance makes sense or grimdark makes sense. But for me, it's not fantasy romance in that first book. And it is considered fantasy romance. So I think once again, I'm kind of like, what's our categorizations again? Because I get maybe I'm mistaken about certain books, but this one, based off of certain criteria, does not fit. And you know, the dark romance stuff, I've seen some pretty interesting, and this could be a whole conversation, but if it was, it would need to be a very long one because there's so many aspects to it. But I've seen some stuff online where people are on Reddit asking for recommendations, and they're basically saying, I want a character who's not consenting, who's in pain, who's not enjoying the experience. There's not even room for maybe it was just unspoken. Like they want to read the darkest, most horrific of circumstances. And I don't fit within that. That's not the kind of thing that I pick up. But it's a whole conversation that isn't necessarily this. But Captive Prince is not quite that. That's why I also don't know dark romance, I think, well enough. There's certainly dark content, but I'm like, I don't know. But it's still like skirting that line where it's like you were saying, there are moments in the story where certainly things are happening that are not okay, but because of the physicality of certain situations, certain characters are still experiencing certain reactions that are just related to your body. And like you said, but it's written where you're like, was that hot? It wasn't, I didn't think so. But I, I read it as like nobody wanted to partake in this. They didn't enjoy it. But other people read it and they're like, I enjoyed that. So I don't know. It's very odd. But I will now mention one that I'm like, this didn't work for me for reasons that are not quite the same at all as what you were just saying, but just are, once again, we don't fit within this, which would be That Time I Got Drunk and Saved a Demon. This one did make me laugh, I will say, because it's kind of poking fun at itself, which I thought was funny. And it had a lot of it was very charismatic, but it's also like bare bones. It's just mostly getting from point A to point B, and then the characters doing it with each other. And they like the male love interest, I don't even like calling him that. He's more of just like this being that exists to make her realize that she enjoys not only doing it with him, but also like that it's a little painful. And he says all the dirty stuff to her and just thinks she's like, he just wants to take her right now. And it's silly. It's silly. So it doesn't work for me because, like you described before, Roger, you want that feeling of there's a plot and the character interactions, they feel earned and there's development. And that's not really what this book was, and that's all right. It's just not for me. But I don't really have a rant necessarily. It doesn't come out of me. It's because that one is so perfectly capturing that this is just not what I am looking for. You know what I mean? Like, I get
the title,
why.
I feel like you get that kind of irreverent.
Yeah.
Like,
right. I mean, and like the author has fun with it. The main character, her and her family, they're spice merchants, and her name is Cinnamon. And her friend's family sells cheese, I think, and her friend's name is Brie.
Does she taste like cinnamon?
Did I say that, or is that?
No,
I was just wondering. Oh, okay. I don't recall. I don't recall
I feel
him saying
I feel like in a lot of romance, there's always like some weird taste descriptors.
Honeydew.
Of, like, it's like, So I was like, oh, is her name Cinnamon? And she tastes like cinnamon.
At first, I was like, did I have a weird Freudian slip or something? No. Anyway, her friend's family.
I'm just a guy and I can't control myself.
That's what it is. That's what it is. So her friend's family sells cheese and her name is Brie, I'm pretty sure. Stuff like that, where you're like, yeah, this author is just being a big goofball and having fun with it. And there's a part where I think sent you a picture, Roger, of the page itself. This moment that made me laugh, where the character said something like, I'm really well endowed, does that help? Or something like that, where it's just like it just knows it's ridiculous. And I appreciate that. That does make me laugh. That actually does tend to be something I enjoy, is when stories are self-aware and over the top and kind of dumb on purpose. But when it comes to storytelling and character development, that's not what I'm looking for at all. Kristen, what about for you? What's one that didn't work?
I'm wondering if I'm going to say the sci-fi one that Roger.
Yeah, that's what let's see it.
Ice Planet Barbarians. This was like just so. I would say it wasn't the worst thing that I've ever read, but there were so many times where I was reading it and I was just like,
those covers is a lie. The fifth one over is the correct cover for this book.
I was just like, what? How did I get here? Even is like kind of what I was questioning, but it's so ridiculous too, because it starts off with like these women get like abducted and they're like in a spaceship, and then their spaceship like crashes. They end up on this planet.
Well, before that even happens, one of them's crying and the alien to shut her up like assaults her.
Yeah.
This is the darkest version of Astrobot ever.
And then like we talked about there needing to be like a genuine connection and everything. Like, these characters do not even speak the same language.
And she's passed out by the fire when he just decides to like, that looks tasty. Like,
yeah. he just like, it's one of those things where it's like he can recognize that I guess she's like his mate or whatever.
Sure.
And she
Oh,
like,
with the freaky heartworms. That's right. They have the things that like. Oh,
yes. And then she's like, what's happening? And like, but then she's like, ooh, like this guy.
yeah,
And
because
then
his anatomy is supposed to be like a rabbit, like personal toy, right? I feel like that's what he's like supposed to be. Yeah.
yeah. And then like there are like 30 something of these books. There are so many of them. And from what I understand too, like because it is this, you know, spaceship that crashed, so there's only a certain number of women. So after a certain number of books, it actually starts cycling back to like the beginning couples, and then you just get like second books from all of the beginning couples, which is strange, but it's just such a weird concept, and it just it's unlike anything I've ever read.
I do have to ask, and feel free to be like, Elle, you're trying too hard to make this into something it's not. Is it trying to say something about the...
I don't think so.
Okay. I didn't even have to keep going.
No, because even the people who love the series, I feel like they talk about it in like this kind of just fun. It's an alien whose equipment is basically built like a pleasurable toy for a woman.
Well,
And like
the reason I was asking, like, is it supposed to be some kind of commentary, or is because I was like, is it supposed to represent like what if society structured and treated men as a means to an end for women's pleasure, and it's supposed to be commentary on like this is how women feel, like men look at, like, is it trying to say something?
I don't think so.
No,
I don't think so. They have
okay.
a weird parasitic pest worm that vibrates in the presence of their mate, and they just
yeah, it's
Okay.
very it's so interesting too about this one is that this series it was originally indie published, but it is now being traditionally published, and it's published by Berkeley, which is a romance imprint versus a fantasy imprint, which a lot of the other fantasy romance comes out under.
Okay. I'm pretty sure I've seen the cartoony covers at Target. And that is pretty funny.
The really funny part of it was, as I think I read it because I asked Mara, I was like, what's a fun like romance that I should read? And she gave me that one. And then I was like ranting to her about it. She's like, oh, I forgot that happened in the first book. You probably should have skipped that one and gone to book 2. And I was like, well, that would have been useful to know.
Well, what happens in book 2 that's supposedly
I don't know.
fun?
I think it's cuter, maybe, because maybe it's a little bit less based on assaulting women and doing things to them while they're unconscious by a fire.
It's a pretty low
waking
bar.
up and being like, oh, it feels so good.
I feel it's a pretty low bar when all you have to do is like, oh, the interactions aren't non-consensual.
They're conscious and talking to each other.
Yeah.
So cute. It's so cute, isn't it? Okay. Any more that anybody wants to mention that are negatives? Or are there any more that you're like, I love this, I want people to check this out, I think it's so good?
I have one example that I put in like my medium category, which is Kingdom of the Wicked by Carrie Maniscalco. Because
the one with all the skulls on it, right? Skulls and snakes.
Yes. I loved the first book so much. I felt like it was so strong, and it had really strong world building. It had a really good mystery element. It follows a girl whose twin gets murdered, and then she essentially has to like team up with someone that she hates in order to figure out who killed her sister. So it's so good. And then book 2 scenes get, and it's also like about the princes of hell. So book 2 gets much smuttier, but it's still good. And then book 3 is like zero plot and just smut. And it was so disappointing because it started so strong, and then it just got progressively, like, it just completely gave up any semblance of needing a story to make sense. And it was just like these two characters hooking up.
What's funny is I've seen people say, oh, you just got to get past the first one because then books 2 and especially book 3 are like, they're so good. So it just depends what you're going into it for. I think what you described, I felt almost like happened for me within book 1, because I went into it already having seen a lot of or glimpsed a lot of conversations because it's all over, right? So I was like, okay, I wonder, I don't know. I'll give it a try. I don't really know what to expect, but we'll see. And then when it first starts, it's like this cool historical fiction. Isn't it like kind of is it like Greek or Venetian or
Italian.
okay, that's what I thought. And then I was like, okay, this historical setting is actually really cool. I really like the way the buildings are described, and when she goes under these like catacomb like areas where he's summoned and stuff, I'm like, okay, and I like the mystery. And then it started to get kind of snarky banter, and I started to like kind of feel like it was taking itself like it was taking the fantasy and the mystery less seriously, and it was kind of leaning into where it's going to go. I felt like that a little bit within book one. So to hear that that's where it goes, I'm like, oh, that makes sense, because that's kind of what I feel like the first book started to give you hints of. But you're saying it's medium for you because you so enjoyed the first.
Yeah, and then really didn't enjoy the last one.
Well, depending on what people like, as you progress, you might end up loving it more and more. By the way, I brought this up as soon as I heard mates, because I gotta say, hate that. I know some people love it, and I'm not saying it's always bad necessarily, but I feel like it's an excuse for characters to not realize why they love somebody. And then it can be done well, but I find more often than not, it just leans into the whole like you're mine thing that you're just like, I don't know. And it just makes me think of animals. And I'm like, I don't like that. I don't like it. I mean, I love animals, but I don't want to think about them in relation to these sorts of situations. Roger, was there another you really wanted to mention? Good, bad, or middle of the road?
I mean, a lot of the other ones are kind of middle. I would say that the only reason I didn't bring up like Anita Blake is I think it takes a long time to get there, because I feel like you don't even meet the first love interest until book 3. And then probably books like 7 through 9 turn into Smutville, and then it kind of unjumps the Smutville shark, and then it goes back into more kind of urban fantasy-y, where there's kind of the mysteries of the week. And so but it does have a really nice polycule. So like if you're looking for, I think it's probably technically reverse harem, but at a certain point, it's not her with everybody. Everybody also starts doing side things. So like
polyamorous.
Yeah, that's why it's called a polycule. So like that one maybe, but like I think one that nobody's talking about is A Strange and Stubborn Endurance by Foz Meadows. I think is a really good fantasy romance, which takes the time to really explore somebody healing from their trauma, because one of the characters is assaulted on Page earlier on and gets kind of shipped off in a marriage of convenience to a neighboring country to kind of try to breeze over a political snafu that happened. And their relationship is just so caring, and like the love interest is like probably too perfect. Like he responds exactly correctly in every situation and is the most understanding, perfect human being that you will ever meet. But I think that's where I like it, because like it does have some smutty scenes, but I think their relationship is more built on this foundational trust and like learning to trust each other and healing from past traumas, and that kind of brings them together. So I think that one's really good.
Kristen, you might be able to help me out here. What is the sci-fi one? Winter's Orbit. That now I almost want Roger you to check out, because it actually sounds, I know you've talked about that book before, but hearing you describe the one that you just mentioned again, hearing you describe it, it sounds like there are some similarities with it and Winter's Orbit. So maybe try Winter's Orbit. You might end up liking that one. It does have some similar components. I won't say which things are similar, so it's still a surprise. I still need to read the next one, because there's another one, and I don't remember if it's a direct sequel or if it's just written by the same author.
Like me with A Strange and Stubborn Endurance. It has a sequel. It's just a duology, and I still haven't read book 2.
I will mention, there's a few that I have up. I never know. This one I feel like it kind of feels like fantasy romance. It's just cute, which would be Half a Soul. But it's more of, once again, leaning into contemporary feeling in a sense, because it's like cozier. It's like cozy gas lamp fantasy. And also, I see Emily Wilde considered fantasy romance, and I've mentioned it when talking about fantasy romance before because I see it considered, but I'm also thinking, I don't know if I would call it that, but I just think Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies is so fun. Compendium of Lost Tales is the third one that'll be coming out very soon at the time we're recording. And I just think that series is a lot of fun. The love interest is is kind of like Howl from Howl's Moving Castle a little bit, where they're just kind of all over the place and they seem like they're not always entirely paying that much attention to what's happening right in front of them. They don't have, it feels like they have a ton of care about certain things, but also at the same time, they feel like flippant almost. And then she's very studious and kind of serious about certain things and introverted, and their dynamic is quite fun. So it does remind me a little of Sophie and Howl from Howl's Moving Castle, except for it's like historical fantasy where they're studying the Fae. So I think Fae is kind of a staple within fantasy romance, and we're kind of slightly doing something different with the way that this one's written. So it does have a lot of fun ingredients to it. And I really enjoy the audiobook narration. I just think it captures, and I'm not trying to say anybody's reading experience is incorrect by any means, but I do feel like there's a dryness to the humor sometimes that is almost difficult to catch until you hear the narrator, and then you hear that subtle snark that's present, and I do enjoy that. So if you are interested in this series and you haven't checked it out, maybe if you're an audiobook listener, consider that one. But I don't think its movement is related to the romance necessarily. That's why I don't consider it fantasy romance. I consider it, which to tie back to our beginning about the categorizations, I guess it would be romantic fantasy, where it's fantasy with a relatively strong romantic subplot. So I definitely have fun with both of those that I mentioned, Half a Soul and Encyclopedia of Fairies. Any more anybody wants to mention? I know we kind of floated around a lot of different topics and areas with our books that we discussed. Was there anything else anybody wants to mention? Kristen, you want to shout out Folk of the Air for a second?
I do love Folk of the Air. That's another one where I'm like, I'm unsure if this is really fantasy romance. Because even though I very much love the relationship in there, what I like most is like the court politics within the Fae, and just seeing the way that a human is able to outsmart people that are so much like stronger and seemingly like more intelligent than her, but she is able to best them on a couple of occasions. And that one is a hate to love relationship. And I just really, those characters just like really speak to me. And I think that Polly Black writes the world of fairy just so like perfectly. Like she writes it very different than a lot of other people. And I think that she captures like the kind of like the violence
malevolence.
And like, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I love that world.
I almost think that one is more a fantasy book that has a lot of what fantasy romance readers like.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it happens to maybe bleed into fantasy a little bit more than fantasy romance. But once again, became popular before fantasy romance was really as currently as rigid as it is with its what it has to have to be qualifying for.
Mm-hmm.
So currently I would say fantasy that appeals to a lot of fantasy romance readers. And then Roger, any last shout outs or things you just gotta be like, I don't like this?
The Infernal Devices is an amazing trilogy, and I think has some really great romantic relationships, and probably has one of the best, like, oh my god, what is it?
Love triangle.
There we go. Thank you. I was like,
yeah.
Agreed. That I've ever read, and I think because I think you're reading that soon, right, Elle, for your steampunk stuff?
I am reading it soon.
Good.
Yeah.
It's so good.
So Infernal Devices, and then I think it's one that
wait. Chat when that happens, when I do read the whole series, perhaps we can reconvene and have a discussion for it. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, keep going.
I think something else I would say, if you really like fantasy but you want a strong romantic relationship that matters in the bigger plot, I think the Burning Kingdoms trilogy by Tasha Suri, so starts with the Jasmine Throne. Especially as you get to books 2 and 3, the romantic relationship becomes more and more important as they're on like opposite political sides, and so there's a lot of conflict and tension there that I think is believable. But it's one that is mainly fantasy but has a strong romantic B plot that is relevant. So if you're somebody who likes maybe almost like fantasy mixed with a little bit of horror, because I know that there's a lot of kind of body horror with how the magic works with like leaves growing out of people's skin. So if you can't handle that, maybe don't do that. But because that just gets more intense as the series goes on. But it's kind of like this weird sci-fi fantasy horror with a strong romantic subplot.
I like how you were saying that, and Elle was like, no, and I'm like,
well, I think she DNF'd it because of it. She hated it. She like tried Jasmine Throne and like.
Yeah, I didn't hate the book. I was just like,
yeah.
every time. Like and it's not that body horror is always that for me, but when you mix it with plants, I don't know what it is. The idea of like plants growing out of a person is just the worst for me. I don't know. I must have some suppressed memory.
I think there was a time where that was really popular on covers. It was like some girl's face with like plants either growing out of it or around it or
yes.
I have something. I don't think this is a real phobia, but I just want to be clear. I like plants a lot, but there's something about plants growing out of things they're not supposed to. Like the idea of a plant growing out of like your drain. Ugh. Like it's the same reaction I get about other phobias that I have that I'm like, no, like honeycombs, the shapes, like or tiny holes where I'm like, no. Anyway.
That or eyeballs where they're not supposed to be.
I can't handle it. I can't handle it. I want to throw out one last question and then we'll wrap it up. What is a book that is very definitively not fantasy romance? You don't have to say the couple's names, but has a couple that you love. And I will say I loved the couple in by the end, just to be clear, because I feel like I don't want to lead anybody astray. The David Bond trilogy has one of my favorite couples. I loved them so much. So that would be my answer for that. Roger, can you think of one that you're like, I love the couple in this, even though this is just purely more so fantasy?
I mean, they're a side couple, but I still love them. And I would say Shades of Magic.
I know. Yeah. Not the main couple.
No.
Side couple.
I mean, they're also fine. Like, I like them, but not as much as the side couple.
Kristen, it feels like this one's a thinker for you.
Yeah, I am trying to think about this. Because I feel like there's a lot of fantasy that I love, and the relationships are like not good.
Right.
So I'm trying to think like.
You're not going to be like Song of Ice and Fire.
Yeah. Or like Name of the Wind. Gosh. I don't know. I wish I had like come prepared for this one.
Oh, I threw this out I know I just kind of threw this out really quick. How about, can you think of a story where there's always kind of the fandom completely ships them, but you never see anything actually? Because I know like Full Metal Alchemist, there's two characters in that everybody's like, yeah, they're together. And I love them, but you never actually see concrete evidence.
I'm still struggling.
I stumped her.
Yeah. I don't know. Because for me, I never have those like, I like go with what the author said. I never have those like fan fiction kind of relationships that I follow. I like believe.
So I made it worse for you.
I guess, okay. The only one that I could see, but I've never read anything to like substantiate it, but like Zuko and Katara, I could see myself.
Oh, you're one of those.
I love Zuko, so why not?
Yeah. Zuko's character.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. That's the perfect way to end it. Then
see him on your shirt at all this whole time that we've been here.
Oh, my friends and I on my side channel did a tier ranking of waifus, and then a separate video of a tier ranking of husbandos. And we did this in honor of Sean and I's anniversary. So Sean was in it too. But one of my friends was like, I'm assuming to not have any awkwardness, these all have to be above the age of 18. And I was like, yeah, we're going to stick with that. And they're like, we can't have Zuko. So that was like one of the things they were asking for, is because they're like, okay, to be fair, I was a kid when I had a crush on Zuko, so it doesn't feel weird. Anyway, I came
just
to
an adult Zuko.
Yeah.
Because he's in Korra a tiny bit, like not really, but he shows up as an old man. So they could just say old man Zuko.
I don't know if that's
the comics too. I feel like they've aged up a bit.
Well, especially not for Christy, I feel. Was she the one who was upset that she couldn't have Zuko?
No, it was Sarah.
Oh.
Yeah, Sarah was like, she said, I think she was saying something like she had a Tumblr that she would, I don't remember exactly. Yeah, old school Tumblr with everybody talking about how much they love Zuko or something. I don't remember the specifics, but she was like, darn. So I was like, sorry. Because I was letting people submit some of their husbandos for the tier ranking for that video. It was a lot of fun. It was a goofy, silly time. And Sean was funny, of course, in that because he's a goofball too. It was fun. Those were fun. But I'll have those linked if anybody.
Oh, I thought of something. Sorry.
Yay! Yay!
Okay, so I mean, it is a relationship in the book, but probably one of my favorite relationships is Vin and Ellen.
Okay.
That's fantasy.
I almost thought about mentioning Mistborn, and then I was like, she would think of it if that's one. I didn't want to like force it, but okay. I won't say anything else because then I feel like I lean into spoiler territory. So I won't say anything else. But Mistborn, you enjoyed the plot line for them.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. You ruined the perfection of the Zuko on his shirt. That's fine. Thanks so much to Roger and Kristen for this. For anybody who reads fantasy romance, let us know what are some recommendations for us and what are recommendations for people who have different tastes than us. Let us know some things that you just feel like are underhyped, underrated. And if you want to also join in on this final question of what's something that's not fantasy romance, but you love the relationship, feel free to leave those recommendations too. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. Check out World Hoppers merch. All the AdSense revenue and merch sales goes to charity. And we'll see you all later. Bye.